Hello and welcome to Unbelievable, the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together to discuss all things theology, philosophy and culture. I'm John Nelson, and today on the show we're discussing a phenomenon that everyone is talking about online, the so-called crisis of meaning. What is it? Where did it come from? And how might we solve it? There are a few people today who have thought more about this meaning crisis than today's guests. John Vervaeke is a cognitive scientist, psychologist and philosopher at the University of Toronto and is co-author of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which you can also find online as a lecture series. Meanwhile, Malcolm Guite is a rock musician turned poet and Anglican priest. He is the author of Lifting the Veil, Imagination and the Kingdom of God, and is a Life Fellow of Girton College, Cambridge. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Very good to be here. John. Hi, John.
I'd like to start by getting to grips with what we mean by the meaning crisis. John, what set of phenomena are you trying to capture when you use that term? Is it simply about mental health, maybe rising rates of loneliness, anxiety, depression, or is it something deeper, maybe civilizational or spiritual?
Yeah, I would make a distinction between sort of the level of the symptoms, things like loneliness, increasing mental health problems, increasing addiction problems, people displacing religiosity onto politics or things like the MCU. Also positive indications that people are seeking to recover that sense of connectedness, like the mindfulness revolution, the psychedelic renaissance. I've been told that there are more Stoics alive now than there were ever alive during the Roman Empire. And some very interesting and potentially odd, from one point of view, features like most organized churches are in decline, but the liturgical churches seem to be plateauing or potentially growing, which no one would have predicted. They're the most Orthodox, traditional, I'm talking about Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Catholic. The Latin Mass is making a huge comeback. And I think this is a hunger for the kinds of connections that actually function to give us meaning in life. Now you have to then talk about the functional level, what's going on. And I think that this sense of connectedness, the metaphor people frequently use is they need to be connected to something larger than themselves. Mm-hmm. That, of course, is not literally true. If I chain you to a mountain, you aren't suddenly relieved of angst. So what I've been arguing is what it means is they want to be connected to a more comprehensive and deeper sense of reality. So it's like when you wake up, awakening, you're in the small world of a dream, and you wake up to the larger world, and from that larger world, you can make those comparative judgments that allow us to track reality better. And people want to be connected to something that is real, that integrates them, that connects them to themselves, to other people, to reality. I think this is deeply adaptive. I think this goes back to some of the primary processes that make us intelligent and capable of rationality. And I think that meaning has to do with aspects of knowing that are not prominent in our culture. Mm-hmm. We have emphasized a propositional tyranny in which propositional knowing is paramount or even exclusive, and we've lost procedural knowing how, we've lost perspectival knowing what it is like, and we've lost participatory knowing by belonging, participating, and being connected. And I would argue that those non-propositional forms of knowing do most of the heavy lifting in that sense of connectedness that is so vital for meaning in life. And I think what's happened basically since the late Middle Ages with the rise of nominalism and going forward, talk about that more in the series. And there's my book, by the way. We've got the rise of a propositional tyranny. We've got the idea of a universal method. And what we've done is we've made meaning a internal, private possession that is largely preferential and in relation to our self-esteem. And well, I mean, the two great philosophers of the 20th century, Wittgenstein and Heidegger, were at great pains to tell us that's exactly not how meaning works. Meaning has to be communally created, curated, and corrected It has to be deeply shareable, and it has to be deeply something that involves our consciousness and our sense of self. And all of this has been seriously truncated. And I think it has been excessively exacerbated by the unfolding of that propositional tyranny and the disconnection from those aspects of our being that are fundamentally responsible for the sense of connectedness that is both deeply adaptive and deeply existentially powerful for us. So that's what I would say.
Malcolm, as a priest and a poet, what did you make of John's diagnosis?
So I think there's lots of common territory there, actually, although we might have a different nomenclature about these things. But I'm certainly aware of the very same malaise that John is speaking about there. He was talking about propositional tyranny. That's an interesting phrase. I mean, C.S. Lewis was once asked at the very end of his life what all his books were about, and he said, against reductivism, against the idea that you can take a material and account arrived at by experiment and analytic reason, which by its very nature deals with quantities and not qualities, and then you can totalize it and says that's the whole of reality. That's fundamentally mistaken. I like the idea, John, that you were talking about awakening, you go from a smaller reality to a larger one. Frankly, I think for all its undoubted benefits, and I'm not an irrationalist, but what we might broadly call the Enlightenment project has ended up taking us from a larger reality to a smaller one. So, I mean, I don't want to cast philosophical blame about the place. I mean, you can't summarize great philosophers in a sentence. But I do think, what people call Cartesian dualism is the beginning of the problem, that he divides the world, as you know, into two things. There's res cogitans, which is the thinking thing, the inside experience of consciousness and reason. And then everything else, he says, is res extensa, just extended stuff. Now, Descartes, of course, to be fair on him, thought that there were three possessors of res cogitans, God and angels and humanity. But his successors soon found they could dispense with God and the angels. And then, of course, they began a reductive process to do with brain, which almost ended up excluding us as well. So that split, that dualism, is radically different. It's recent. It's only the last, to 300 years in the West. In the scientific West, men in the West, men in power. Most of humanity for most of the time has had a more subtle and more inclusive way of knowing. Of course, they've deployed reason. I mean, the Greeks, Socrates makes it clear to us. Aristotle makes it even clearer that you can use, I didn't write a book called The Logic for nothing, or the physics or the metaphysics. But there's a great book called The Greeks and the Irrational. The Greeks also had Homer, they had the tragedies, they had the Eleusinian mysteries. So on the one hand, they had the Parthenon up there with all its perfect geometry. But on the other hand, as it were, they're kind of the caves beneath Earth. So I think we've split our ways of knowing. I mean, this is approached in a different way, but with similar results by Ian McGilchrist in The Master and His Emissary. But essentially, in the last 200 or 300 years, we said the analytical reason, reducing things essentially to, their atomized parts and the interaction of those parts, has been privileged. And all the intuitive ways of knowing, all the holistic ways of knowing, the imagination broadly, which is the thing that gives us meaning, we'll come back to that perhaps later, has been downplayed. And downplayed to the point, to go back to the Cartesian thing, we eventually, that res cogitans, res extensa split became a merely subjective as opposed to actually objective out there. And we're talking about ways of knowing here, episteme, to know. So what I think we came up with, which has caused real problems to everybody, is a kind of, if I can call it that, it's an epistemological apartheid. The appalling thing about apartheid in South Africa was that they claimed to be preserving out there these separate little Bantu stands over there, separate development, where you could have all your lovely African traditions, but they had no purchase on the main economy of things, which was, the privileged white one. And I think we've done this thing where we've got little Bantustans of arts and arty and imaginative stuff, but it doesn't have any purchase on reality. Reality is what's in the test tube and what's reductible and what is capable of being verified by a reproducible experiment. And it's not that that doesn't deal with reality, but it only deals with one aspect of reality. The other one is missing. But I think this has led precisely to the crisis of meaning. And I think I'm quite optimistic. I think we're at a turning point where we can recover ways of knowing. So back in the day, I mean, it's quite a long time ago, so 2010, I think, I published a book called Faith, Hope and Poetry, which was subtitled Theology and the Poetic Imagination. But essentially that book was a defense of the imagination as at least potentially a truth-bearing faculty. That there are things we can know rationally, and there are things we can only know imaginatively. So the great watchword for me was Shakespeare's wonderful account of poetry in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He says, the poet's eye and fine friends. Well, first of all, he says, imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. So he uses these twin ways of knowing. Comprehend, you can get your mind around it. Apprehend, you're reaching for it. So he says, imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. Then he gives this famous definition of poetry. He says, the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And here's the key line. As imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Now, he puts this in the mouth of a hostile witness who's supposed to be dissing poetry. But the point of it there is imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. Because a thing is unknown doesn't mean it's not real. Obviously, we would have no advance in science if the things science has yet to discover were not actual. But there are some things which we don't know until we have a form in which to know them. And we have to kind of find the model or the shape. And this is true in science as well as in the arts. I mean, Coleridge had a brilliant image for this. He talked about imagination as the sacred power of self-intuition. So he has this wonderful analogy. He says, in The Horned Fly, he says, when the pupa is about to make its cocoon, its carapace, as he calls it, for what it will evolve into, what it metamorphose in. It makes these great shapes. It leaves room in its involucrum, says Coleridge, for antennae yet to come. Something in it knows enough to hold open a space for something into which holds the space for what the antennae will grow into. And so basically Coleridge makes the case for the imaginative arts as often prophetic, often getting to a place that reason may eventually get to, but holding open the space and the shape of that. So I very strongly feel we need to reintegrate these two ways of knowing. Just to finish, sorry, long answer to a short question. There's a lovely phrase in one of C.S. Lewis's late essays where he says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning, We know all this stuff, but we don't know what to do with it. This is. I mean, I'm glad meaning is the fundamental issue. I mean, Owen Barfield said, "It's a curious fact that the more and more we know about the minutiae of the world in which we find, the more we analyze it, the less capable we are of finding any meaning in it. This is because we've abandoned one of the organs, the capacities that we have for knowing, which we need to recover."
John, I'd love to hear what you make of this idea that maybe the Enlightenment and modernity is the kind of key antagonist in this meaning crisis, because I kind of got the impression that this meaning crisis is something we were living through now in a kind of peculiar way. I mean, do you think that the meaning crisis has been bubbling up and it is now manifesting in a particular way? Or is the meaning crisis in some sense something that we've always lived with since the Enlightenment?
Well, I mean, there's a deeper always. I think human beings are perennially prone to crises of meaning. We saw one during the Hellenistic period, post Alexander's empire, and philosophy goes through a change where it becomes more therapeutic to address that suffering. So I have to understand we can always fall into despair or absurdity or alienation or angst. But what we've typically had is we've had cultural I call them ecologies of practices, to give a sense of a living system of interdependent parts that have helped correct for the ways in which our meaning-making machinery can go awry because of certain cultural or historical factors. Now, I do think that starting in the late Middle Ages with the rise of nominalism, which starts the removal of the idea that there are real patterns in the world. And then I agree totally with Malcolm. When we get all the R's, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, the Promethean spirit, that we can make the kingdom of heaven on earth. I think all of those R's do bring about the meaning crisis. And I think what I would say the Enlightenment did, it's very interesting. I've been talking a lot about this, both at a course I teach on the cognitive science of religion at U of T, and a course I teach on my online platform called Seeing God Again for the First Time, about modernity. Again, like Malcolm, I'll try and be as brief as I can, but this is a long story. I wrote a whole book about this process. So modernity basically looks at this vertical dichotomy between the natural and supernatural, and post-Aquinas, it comes more and more to believe that the natural can be explained on its own terms, and that vertical dichotomy is in some sense absurd. But then what it does is it can't get rid of all of the function of that lower world, upper world mythology. And I don't use mythology in a pejorative sense. I'm not Richard Dawkins. That lower world, upper world mythology was doing a lot of work about giving people, how do I distinguish appearance from reality? Where do my moral intuitions come from? How do I progress in the cultivation of wisdom? It was right. The very notion of transcendence is an upward kind of motion. So there's a lot of functionality there, right? And so what it did is, and this will sound a little bit like a postmodern critique, but I think this is what is value in postmodernity, is it surreptitiously took that vertical dichotomy and replaced it with a bunch of horizontal ones. There was mind-body, as Malcolm represented, which very quickly becomes subjective, objective, values in here, facts. Look, this is William Desmond. As soon as you make this radical dichotomy between value and fact, what you have is there's no value out there. There's just facts in here. I only get value out there by projecting, but projecting is an illusion. And in reality, I'm just an insignificant piece of metaphysical nothing.
Yeah.
And so, right. So it's all just nihilistic. And all of these dichotomies is odd, right? What they do, here's my main claim, is they sever the connectedness, the religio that is at the heart of what we mean by meaning. When we're talking now, not just the meaning of a sentence, when we talk about our life being meaningful. Yeah. So I think this is the radical thing the Enlightenment does. Just one more thing, Malcolm, if I could address your bodying forth. There's a whole branch of cognitive science called 4E Cog Sci, in which embodiment, the fact that we're embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended, right, is trying to emphasize those non-propositional ways of knowing, our skills, our conscious perspective taking, our co-identification, how we assume an agency and assign an identity, an arena to our actions. All of those kind of knowings are more primary for cognition. And to come to the imaginal, the idea is that those forms of, let's call them sensory motor initially, orientation and navigation get repurposed. The technical term is exapted into our cognition. So notice what I'm doing with my hands. I'm gesturing. Notice that I cannot speak without invoking metaphor. These are not ornaments. If I remove your use of metaphor in speech, if I restrict your hands so you can't talk, your cognitive performance radically degrades. You start to feel disconnected, depersonalized, right? So the idea is that by bringing in, talking about our skills, our conscious perspectives, our states of selfhood and personhood, these are much more crucial. And for me, they are trying to get us and to bring us back to a realization that this connectedness, which is often imaginal, not imaginary, but imaginal in Corbin's sense. Look, reason depends on me being able to look at my own cognition. What is that space inside my head? It's not a literal space, but it's not an illusion, because it gives me real knowledge that is central to the metacognitive abilities I need.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be rational. Right?
So the very distinction you make there between it's not literal, but it's not an illusion. and the absolute necessity of metaphor. I think that actually opens up all the space that we need to realize that that, as you say, the imaginal is in touch with a reality which is as real as anything. So just, you were describing that awful sense of, everything out there is objective and factual but has no values, and values are island in here but they don't. And then the use of the word imaginary is non-real. So just here's a quotation, again, C.S. Lewis, writing Inspired by Joy in the early 1950s. He's looking back 30 years to how it was for him as a young philosophy don, because before he did literature, I mean, he managed to get 3 firsts in Oxford at the same time in classics, English and philosophy. But philosophy was the first job he got, right? So he's back as a kind of, I think, mentally quite wounded, but ultra-rationalistic atheist, young don. But he has a guilty secret or a guilty pleasure, and that is poetry and mythology. So this is what he says directly. It's so well written, I remember it literally. So he says, the 2 hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one hand, on the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Then here's the killer line. Nearly everything I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly everything I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. And I think that is a bifurcation, a kind of horrible split in mind that we all inherited, actually, not just Lewis in the 20s. Now, I would say, of course, to throw in a misapplied quotation, but that which God hath joined together, let no man put asunder, that I think that this was a false split, an unnecessary split. Now, I have to say, and you might say, I would say this as a Christian priest, but I certainly for Lewis, the way to heal that actually came as part of his return to Christianity. But it was a very specific thing. He loved mythology, and he particularly loved the myths of dying and rising gods. But his rationality said, well, they're myths in the sense they may be great, meaningful stories, but they didn't actually take place. So he felt that he was cheating his reason if he went along with a myth that he knew to be only a myth. But on the other hand, mere historical events not breathed into life by a kind of deeper mythology, you would go, so what? So there's a famous story about how he and Tolkien were walking, this is before he's become a Christian, round Addison's Walk in Oxford, talking about all the things that delight them. So they're talking about mythology, and Tolkien says, yes, but the problem with myths is that they're lies, even though, they are lies breathed through silver. And Tolkien says, no, they're not lies. May not be literally true, but, if you like, he's not quite got to your word imaginal, John, but, but nevertheless, the heart of man is not compound of lies, that they carry some primal wisdom. So they debate about that. Then they come on to the subject of Christianity. And Lewis says to Tolkien, well, I can be persuaded of the existence of the historical Jesus. That's fine. And I may even be persuaded that, he died on the cross. Maybe one extraordinary exception. There are exceptions to everything. He rises from the grave. Well, bully for Jesus. My dad didn't rise from his grave. My friends who died on the Western Front. So what? I don't see what difference the life, death, and alleged resurrection of some guy 2,000 years ago makes to me here in Oxford. And of course, Tolkien says, I can't believe you're saying that, Jack. You've just been telling me how totally you resonate with the myth of the dying and rising god, with Balder or Adonis. Can't you see that on this one occasion, the great story, the great mythical thing, without losing any of its mythic resonance, its deeper charge of what death and resurrection mean at many, many levels, also becomes historical fact, so that you get this weird, like the mentioning of the names of, tiny little apparatchiks and bureaucrats when Quirinius was governor of Syria or under Pontius Pilate, locates it in a very mundane historical. But in this case, it happens. The mythology, though the great writers of this, the Homers of this world, had language as their medium, and language is mysterious enough as it is. But in this case, if one were to imagine a creator, he would have the substance of history as the medium through which to enact a myth which is... And while talking is talking, you can almost feel those two alienated hemispheres of Lewis's mind sort of quivering and coming together satisfactorily on something which he can analyze with his reason and think about as in the realm of the verifiable and historical. But at the same time, it doesn't lose any. So there's the beginning for him. I'm not saying this is the only way it would be healed, but there's the beginning for him of the healing. I mean, obviously, I'm sure he would say, if people asked him that Christ was a personal savior, but he's also a very satisfying solution to an epistemological problem. And I think this works at a deeper level. I was very interested in what you were saying, John, about the transcendent, the heaven-earth model. And of course, you can look at a lot of great world religions, and certainly, early Judaism, but equally early Greek religion, and certainly Egyptian things, where you're trying to make a temple in which is a model of heaven. You're trying to find some imagined, constructed shape on earth that can resonate sufficiently with the unknowable heavenly for the two to be connected. I mean, another way of putting it is in an Old Testament image is Jacob's ladder. The angel. This longing for the connection is crucial to all religions. And of course, the scandalous claim, I mean, this is the scandal of particularity, I don't think Christians should shy away from it, is the claim that in the end, the fullness of that connection doesn't happen with a bodily, with an architectural temple. It doesn't happen with a philosophical system. It doesn't happen in any of those ways. This thing that every system and temple have been trying to edge their way towards actually happens with the body of a particular person, whom the Romans crucify. But the aim is the same. I mean, I always think Christians should read their ancient history and their accounts of every world religion with immensely open and sympathetic and empathetic eyes, because these are all, from a Christian point of view, adumbrating the same need and feeling their way perhaps towards that solution.
Well, I do want to talk more about myth and imagination, but we do need to take a short break. If you're enjoying this show and want to see others like it, check out premierunbelievable.com. We'll be back in just a moment.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations.
The ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews. It gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates.
Welcome back to Unbelievable, where I'm discussing the meaning crisis with John Vervaeke and Malcolm Guite. John, I wondered if we could diagnose a little bit more where this meaning crisis comes from, because Malcolm has been talking about the importance of mythology. And obviously, when we use that phrase myth today, we see it as the unreal. I wonder if you could maybe sketch in a bit more detail the kind of philosophical and historical developments that led to the meaning crisis.
So I think what I would want to do is to talk a little bit more about what we mean by meaning and what its relationship is to truth, and before we could answer that question well. Because I think as long as we keep certain notions as presuppositions unchallenged, the attempt to talk about myth is going to be hamstrung by all these undisclosed and unquestioned dichotomies. So that, if you'll allow me, I want to address that first. So I want to get clear on what I think I'm talking about when I'm talking about meaning. And I prefer to use the Latin word religio, which is one of the candidates for the etymological origin of religion, religiare, which is also ligament, and the notion of binding is what I want to make reference to. And I want to start with something that sounds like it has nothing to do with religion or myth at all, which is your intelligence, your making sense ability, your sense-making ability. And I want to point out to a perennial and profound problem. In fact, it's a meta problem. It's a problem you face whenever you're trying to solve any problem. Because before you solve any problem, you have to make sense of the situation. And here's the problem. It has to do with your attention and your memory. What could you pay attention to now? How much information is actually available to you in the environment? Well, it turns out, I won't get into the formal argument, it's combinatorially explosive. The number of patterns, the number of ways in which you could orient your attention. Do I look and, the aspects, do I look at this as a bottle, a tool, something made out of metal, something I could use as a weapon, etc. And then what I do is I rely on your memory. Yeah, what do you draw from memory and all the possible connections you could make there? And then, are the ones that will matter. Well, what do you mean by mattering? I have to consider possibilities of how things will turn out. What are the number of possibilities I can consider? The number of possible pathways for an average game of chess outnumbers the number of atomic particles in the universe. You can't check all the possibilities. You can't check all the possible combinations in your memory. You can't check all the information in the environment. And here's the thing, and it'll sound Zen almost. You're intelligent because you ignore most of that information almost instantaneously, and you zero in on what's relevant. Now, notice the word relevant. Really, really stop and pause on it, phenomenologically, experientially. Relevance isn't cold calculation. It's how you care. It's how you commit your limited and precious resources. And notice also, is it purely subjective? No, I can be wrong in my judgments of relevance. I thought she was angry. It turns out she's afraid. What I was foregrounding and backgrounding, what was salient to me, was wrong. Is it purely objective? Is this always relevant at all times? That doesn't make any sense. Relevance is neither objective nor subjective. It's transjective. It's what William Desmond calls the metaxu. It is the binding. It is that which is before, beneath, between, and beyond all of the horizontal dichotomies that beset modernity. That is the place where the betweening happens. And what I want to say about that is, I think that's what people are primarily talking about when they're talking about meaning as meaning in life. It's that sense of binding, that sense of connectedness that is deeper than their subjective experience, deeper than their objective attributions, but binds them together. That's the meaning that makes the binding of truth possible. Now, the thing about truth and relevance is relevance constrains what we consider. We don't search for all possible truths. You won't find a scientist studying if the number of paper clips in their top drawer corresponds to the number of squirrels they're going to see on Tuesdays. The number of possible propositions they could explore is vast. They zero in on ones that are relevant, important, salient, crucial. These are all synonymous terms. Relevance constrains what we consider truth, but truth corrects what we consider relevant. They're like an Heisenberg complementarity. I always have to assume I've got relevance to judge truth, or I have to assume I have truth to give me the error or feedback to correct my relevance. And you can't there's no place to step outside of that and go, that's what they are, the view from nowhere all at once. The view from nowhere is impossible. Gödel showed it's logically impossible. Einstein showed it's physically impossible. And Heisenberg showed it's epistemically impossible. We have to give up that model. Now I can tell you what I think myth is. Myth is the imaginal apprehension of the metaxu, of the betweening, of that which fits the world and us together so we can fundamentally belong together. It is our meta-meaning system that makes all our individual meanings and all of our specific claims possible. And we have lost the sense of the need for that because we replaced mythic metaxu with a universal method. This is Descartes, the universal calculus, in which I do not have to commit. I do not have to bind. I do not have to transform myself in order for truths to be disclosed. We removed the maturational aspect, the wisdom aspect of meaning. We know this is false. Children have to become adults for certain truths to be disclosed to them. But as the child is to the adult is to the sage. Why would we think that our capacity for self-deception and illusion goes away just because we become 21 years of age? It doesn't cease. Those very processes that are having us ignore information also make us perennially prone to self-deception, every single moment. So another way of talking about the meaning crisis is a wisdom famine. We have a glut of information, but we don't know. I ask my students, where do you go for information? They hold up their phones, the internet, right? Where do you go for knowledge? They're very postmodern, so I don't know, maybe the university. And then I say, where do you go for wisdom? And there's an anxious silence because they've lost the sense of the need to constantly address self-deception, which I think is a much better notion of reason than logic. And they have lost the sense that requires binding and transformation. And that's imaginal and mythical. It's narrative in nature.
You know, that distinction you just made, John, I mean, now, do carry on.
You take it away, Malcolm.
I'm just going to chip in a bit of poetry here because it directly speaks into what you've said. So you made that distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. And this,
yes, Eliot.
Exactly. Well, you got there before me. So Eliot in the Choruses from the Rock says, he asks two questions. He says, where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And suddenly you become aware of this hierarchy of knowing. And, you know, the more, I remember when they used to talk about the information age and the information economy and information technology. But suddenly you discovered the more information you have, the more you need knowledge to know what to do with it and how to organizing it. Now we're finally beginning to discover, just before we kind of make catastrophic errors, that the more knowledge we have, the more wisdom we need to know what that knowledge is. So that hierarchy, I think, is really, really important. I also loved what you said there, John, about there are certain ways of knowing which cannot be detached or dispassionate. They involve commitment, that the relevance. Now, there's a very interesting, in the discussions around what we could know about our faith and how we can know things that were taking place at some heat, I have to say, in one of your hours, the Reformation, the discussion within the Church of England. There's one of the founding figures of the Anglican Church is a guy called Richard Hooker, who wrote a book with the incredibly unsexy title, An Inquiry Concerning the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Like a good editor would have done something with that. But it's actually a very monumental philosophical work, and Shakespeare drew on it in various ways. But anyway, but in a sermon attached to it, he makes a really interesting distinction between what he calls the certainty of evidence and the certainty of adherence. And he says you need both. You can never ignore evidence. But there are certain things you can only know by trying them out. And there are certain aspects of, and he makes the obvious example in human relationship. You can't test out every possibility in a human relationship and know in advance by deduction what it would be like to love someone without taking the risky commitment of loving them. Then there are things you will only know by loving. And there's a relationship between love and knowledge. So he says there are certain things which are true, but fall outside the realm of demonstration, the certainty of evidence, because they fall within this realm of the certainty of adherence, and it takes a certain kind of commitment, a kind of communal commitment in order to know these things. And again, I feel like that's a knowledge. Maybe the postmodernists are kind of gradually getting to that in their thinking about the social construction, or the social, I wouldn't use the word construction, but I think there are things we can know in community that we can't know individually. And one of the problems, I think, of the crisis of meaning is this extreme isolated, individualism. The only thing I wanted to chip in here, again, this is specifically about meaning, and I don't know how you would respond to this, but the product of the characteristic, if you like, theological product of the Enlightenment is 18th century deism, not theism, but deism. And this is the idea that God, if you like, is the watchmaker. It's a classic thing. As soon as we invent something, we're then immediately tempted to make it the model of everything else. So we invent a self-regulating mechanism like a piece of clockwork. We say, wow, the universe must be like clockwork. Just like after we invent computers, we start awfully referring to each other as having hardware and software, and we use the blasphemous idea of reprogramming people. Anyway, if you have the idea of the universe as essentially a self-regulating mechanism governed by what Newton had discovered about the laws of motion, then even if it had an original maker, I mean, that God can retire to an infinite distance and be paring his fingernails while the world runs down. There's no connection. There's no living back and forth between the divine and the worldly. There's no interplay between the transcendent and the immanent. It's just a mechanism. Now, as a model, certainly when you're trying to work out planetary motion and that kind of thing and the movement of the heavens, and you've made this massive move from the geocentric to the heliocentric, Newton's laws of the conservation of momentum, the momentum being mass times velocity, are very useful. There is a mechanical calculation. One doesn't want to deny that. But they're not total. And the model of mechanism for the cosmos is not the only one available. And the problem with the model of mechanism is precisely that it doesn't have intrinsic meaning. Now, an alternative model, one revived, he didn't invent it, but revived and very much proposed by Coleridge, as much in his role as philosopher and theologian as poet, is the model of speech or utterance. That this is something being that the cosmos is utterance. Now, utterance is physical, right? I mean, if I give you a poem, you can take the piece of paper and you can, with the poem on it, and if you didn't know it was a poem, you could spend a year analyzing the chemistry of the paper, and you'd probably be able to work out which trees were grown where to pulp the paper. You could do wonderful things. And you could spend another year analyzing the ink, and you could do a mathematical study of how these weird little squiggles actually had some kind of patterning in them, and so on. And all this time you would never know it was a poem. Now, if I walked into the room and read it to you, you go, oh my God, it's a poem. It means all these squiggles and this paper means something. Now, that would not in any way deny or obviate all that stuff you found out about its physicality. Indeed, some of the stuff you found out, like how frequently letters repeated and, all of that, might be significant to the meaning of the poem as it happens. But you would still need, you're experiencing the reality of the thing I've given you at another level. So Coleridge later worked this out very rigorously philosophically, but he had a poetic intuition. So perhaps one of Coleridge's most famous poems, The Frost at Midnight, where he's thinking about what was difficult about his own upbringing and the kind of education he had. And he's sitting in this cottage and he's got his little boy Hartley, who's still a slumbering infant, and trying to think about how he'll grow up. And he famously says, thou, my child, shalt wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountains that mirror in their bulk both lakes and shores. So it's his description of wonderful landscape. And then he says this, so shalt thou see and hear. But he doesn't say, so shalt thou see and hear certain geological formations, certain meteorological cloud conditions, although those are undoubtedly at one level what the little boy will see and hear. And he doesn't deny that what he's seeing and hearing is shapes, seeing shapes, hearing sounds. But what he says in the poem is, thou shalt wander like, so shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who doth teach himself in all and all things in himself. Great universal teacher, he shall mold thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. Now, extraordinary. I've often seen that quoted in signs that he's a pantheist. I mean, he's clearly not a pantheist because he sees the cosmos as utterance. But the key word is intelligible. The lovely shapes and sounds intelligible. It's one of the glories of, the whole philosophical tradition that we inherit from the Greeks onwards, and certainly one of the glories of the scientific revolution. And some people would say this depends on the whole doctrine of the Logos and everything being made in the Logos, that we should consider the world to be intelligible, and that we should want to find out more about it and explore its intelligibility. I mean, we could, obviously, in the East, it was possible to take a different view and to say it is entirely delusional and you're wasting your time trying to find any coherence in it. You should get straight onto the transcendence of it. But anyway, the intelligibility of the world is characteristic. But what of our whole way of seeing in the West, but what we've done is we've narrowed that intelligibility to the intelligibility of the structure rather than the intelligibility of the meaning. And Coleridge elevates the word. He says, the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language. So I think we lost that. And I think you can see the contrast in how we lost the sense of language. If you take two classic remarks about the stars, separated by, over 1,000 years. So famously, the opening of Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord, and the firmament showeth forth his handiwork. Night unto night uttereth speech, although there is no language, it goes on to say. So that's an intuition about something about what you see when you see the stars. Now, by contrast, our friend Pascal, and I've got lots of time for Pascal, but in the Pensée, he has this extraordinary bit. It's just like there's so many that are just like one-off lines. He says, le silence éternel de ces vastes espaces m'effraie. So the eternal silence of these vast spaces frightens me. And the movement from looking at the heavens and thinking, God, it really means something, it's telling me something about pattern and glory, to looking at it and say, oh my goodness, I'm utterly insignificant and I'm lost in the meaningless cold vacuity of space. That's the contrast between an earlier and a present view. But I think I don't think we're recovering the earlier in some naive, I hope not. I hope it's not going to be a naive rejection of all that we've gained from the analytic scientists. But I hope we're going to recover it by way of integration so that we not only know our physics, but our metaphysics. And we not only perceive the earth, but we perceive the heavenly in and through the earthly. It's both and rather than either or. It
was reminding me also of a poem by John Donne, where I think, writing around that same time of the scientific revolution, he says that man is lost. 'Tis all his pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. I wonder, as we're sort of diagnosing the meaning crisis, John, whether there's anything you wanted to add before we go to another break.
Yeah, I want to talk about logos. I want to talk about what, so deism is, it's the Newtonian Humean dream of purely spectator knowing, that I can stand back as an absolute still spectator and in this view from nowhere somehow see things as they truly are. This is not how knowing works. That epistemology is fundamentally based on almost completely erroneous cognitive science. Even when you think you're still, your eyes are moving. You're saccading, and you are constantly moving when you're even trying to hold still because you're bipedal. And of course, you actually know by moving around. If something strikes you as slightly off, you'll move your head, you'll switch, you'll ask somebody who's got another perspective what they see. Yeah. So you will move literally or you will move imaginatively, right? So there is no perception without movement, and there's no movement without perception. This is another thing that Fourier Cogsci emphasizes. The Enlightenment cut them from each other, and they should not be cut from each other. That's not how perception and cognition works. Soon as you understand that we are bound, like we are shaping the environment and the environment is shaping us, and we're doing that biologically, we're doing that interactionally, we're doing that cognitively, we're doing that even in our consciousness. Because what am I foregrounding and backgrounding in the environment? All that sort of stuff. Then you have to go back and think about what was meant by intelligibility, because we're talking about sense making. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make sense of our sense making, if I can put it that way. This is Evan Thompson's wonderful phrase. And I would propose to you the following. I think that logos, what the Greeks meant, is exactly this deep primordial complementarity between relevance and truth, because logos has to do with disclosure, aletheia, but it has to do with drawing things together so they belong together. It's this primordial. You're always presupposing that that grammar inside your cognition, and I don't like this metaphor, I'm just using it for ease of reference, and the grammar of how reality realizes itself they participate in the same principles and patterns. If not, you're caught in another devastating dichotomy of modernity. John Locke, I'm inside some little cabinet somewhere. I'm somehow getting postcards from the world. I don't know if they're from the world. And I'm in a mania of trying to arrange those internal postcards that somehow represent reality so that I'll get back to reality. And the idea is, well, the pictures correspond. How do they correspond? I have to stand outside of me and the world, back to where God is, if you're a deist. Look at what's going on in your mind. Look at the world and say, hey, those match, something you can never do. And this whole notion of an inner coherence of representations that somehow mathematically correspond to reality dooms us to solipsism and skepticism. I think logos is inherently bound up with religio, and religio is inherently bound up with being embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. This is just a fundamentally different way of understanding things. And I think what's happening right now, if you allow me a couple of Hegelian terms, I think the zeitgeist is the meaning crisis. I think the Weltgeist is an advent of the sacred. The sacred through science and literature and poetry and these kinds of conversations, which would not have happened 15 years ago.
Exactly.
Something is taking shape. There is a logos in things, gathering them together so they belong together, but also connecting to a reality that we haven't been disclosing properly. Wow. And I think the advent of the sacred is the response that is emerging in a spontaneous fashion cross-culturally.
Yeah, in all the disciplines, in all the disciplines as well. It's fascinating.
Yeah, across the disciplines. Yes, yes.
History. We unfortunately only have another 20 minutes to try and solve the meaning crisis. Now that the logos is gathering everything together. But before we do that, we need to take another short break. So if you're enjoying this show, please do follow us on X. That's at Unbelievable FE, or Premier Unbelievable on YouTube and Instagram. We'll be back in just a moment.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question. We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms. The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. The difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online, so thanks again.
Welcome back to Unbelievable, where I'm discussing the meaning crisis with John Vervaeke and Malcolm Guite. In the last part of this conversation, I want to discuss how we might resolve the meaning crisis. And we're probably not going to do this in 20 minutes. But John, I wonder about your relationship with Christianity. And Malcolm was talking earlier about sort of the idea of Christ as the myth became fact. Does that hold any sway for you as a kind of solution to the meaning crisis?
I do think I've been on an actual pilgrimage It got 3 legs to it. I'm only gone to first part. First part was 6 weeks through Europe, and I was basically treading the road, the thread of Neoplatonism as it runs through Judaism, paganism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And what I'm trying to do there, and I'm going to use a word because I don't like the modern word dialogue, I'm trying to afford dialogos, the logos that we've been talking about here. And what I want is I'll use Tolkien here. I want Buddhism to be a way in which Christians can recover their Christianity, but I also want Christianity to be a way in which Buddhists can recover their Buddhism.
Wow.
And that is what I'm deeply trying to afford. And there's Christians that talk this way. Paul Nitter's really excellent book, Without Buddha, I Couldn't Be a Christian. There's also a very good book. I can't remember the author right now. He's a Zen Buddhist, and he's going through Christianity to recover his Zen. And I think that look, I made a mistake. The hallmark of rationality is a willingness to publicly admit to error. When I originally wrote The Meaning Crisis, I talked about the religion that's not a religion, which was an engineering project. Can we somehow get all the functions of religion and extract them from all the existing religions and engineer? And I've come to realize that was a profound and ironically modernist mistake on my part, that if you try to manufacture the logos, you have throttled it, because it has to show up of its own accord and take on a life of its own. Because that we talk about resonance. Think about Hartmut Rosa's work on resonance, the uncontrollability of the world. The moments that I love are not the moments where I'm in complete control. When I turn a corner and there's a beautiful snowfall, or somebody says something unexpected in deep dialogos that calls me beyond where I could go on my own. I have to get that place where there's an uncontrollability that nevertheless I can stretch and reach and make sense of. Those are the moments that I want. And so I want to bring all of the traditions in which people have ecologies of practices, cultivating wisdom, enhancing religio, into that kind of resonant dialogos with each other as a way of affording the advent of the sacred. That is my project, and that is my answer.
Oh, well, that's brilliant. I mean, there's so much I can resonate with in terms of, I love your phrase, the advent of the sacred. But for me, the real core point of connection was just the word logos. And I think earlier, when just at the end of the previous section of the program, you actually talked, you used the word grammar, which I was quite interested in. You talked about cognitive grammar, but then you talked about the grammar of things, as it were.
Yes.
Now, that's really important, because as I understand the Logos, and I'm not just talking about the Logos as we encounter it in the prelude to John's Gospel, but the long tradition going back to Heraclitus, and all of that is hugely significant to me. And to speak, if when John's prologue does begin, en arche, en ho logos, in the beginning was the word, but arche isn't as important as the word logos. It is this prime before being thing. So I take it that one of the reasons why we can have hope, in fact, to have a kind of coherence between inner and outer and self and world, is that there is if they have a common origin in logos in its broadest term as sacred meaning, then since they're both from this one source, there's a chance. And of course, there's very interesting, going back to your wanting to bring all the different traditions together and share common nurture and practice. Of course, John's gospel is the gospel that says he is the light that lightens everyone that comes into the world. Doesn't specifically mention Christians, and he is in him, all things were made, without him was not anything made that was made, all things. So what that does, and I felt you were doing this just a minute ago, John, is it reverses the flow. Instead of us having to kind of make stuff happen and make meaning happen, we can do. So one of my favorite stories about Coleridge is one of his great heroes was Thomas Clarkson, who was the founder of the campaign against slavery. And, it was a long, difficult thing to show what was obviously ethically right, constantly rejected. And eventually Clarkson, who was the guy who recruited Wilberforce, has a kind of collapse. And it's kind of compassion fatigue and nervous exhaustion and a loss of hope, a crisis. So his friends club together and get him a cottage in the Lake District to recover for a week or two. And he bumps into Coleridge. And he confides to Coleridge this collapse if you like, a crisis of meaning. He says, it's not just that I've lost hope for the campaign. He says, I'm losing my faith. And then he says to Coleridge, he says, I have no idea anymore of the divine. Mm-hmm. And Coleridge, classic Coleridge in response, he says, my dear Clarkson, don't worry for the moment about whether you have any idea of the divine, but never forget that you are a divine idea, that you are in the Logos. And you and I are logoi from the Logos. We are little words from the word. And then he says, the Logos has not finished speaking Thomas Clarkson into the world. He's not finished saying to the world the part of meaning that you are. And he hasn't finished it. So as Coleridge says, try not to become an impediment in the speech of Christ. But you don't have to go into the specifics of Christianity to say, if we have some sense that both word and world and the inner world are linked, that there is and this is, I mean, I'd be sympathetic with your take on the Neoplatonists, and indeed, I don't talk about the Cambridge Platonists, that there is a pattern and meaning which underlies the rippling transcendent manifestations of that pattern and meaning. And we need, as it were, and can be grounded in that. I think that gives us hope. And I think, I mean, all kinds of, you're talking about the return of the sacred, a phrase I love. You think about Tom Holland's book, Dominion, and his whole sense of re-owning and representing the notion of the sacral. You know, that's coming from, if you like, a secular historian. You've got all kinds of disciplines, I think, beginning to feel and find their way. And I think we need to be generous to each other. We must not hold up creedal barriers to one another and say, oh, I can't have the conversation unless you tick these creedal boxes. I think we have to recognize that there is a recovery of reintegrated vision, and it's coming towards us from every angle, not just from within the circles of faith.
But then a lot of people, Malcolm, would say, you know, I'm spiritual, not religious. I'd love this kind of, I suppose, a kind of proverbial corpus callosum, which brings together the left and right hemispheres. So I suppose as an Anglican priest, someone who administers the sacraments, lives in the sacraments, what's the important not only of dialogue?
I think this distinction between spiritual and religious is a bit specious, and it also means, you know, I can just float away on my own touchy-feely vibe, and it actually turns out to be another aspect of Western individualist consumerism. And then I just go around all the world religions as though they were the pick and mix sweets in Marks and Spencer and get the little bits I like. I don't think that'll do. I love the way, John, you got back to the roots of the word religio. And I think we need to the certainty of adherence. There has to be commitment. You can't faff about forever on some crossroads going 5 minutes down one road and back and then 5 minutes down another road. I think you have to commit to know certain things. And when people say to me, I believe in spirituality, but I don't believe in organized religion, I feel like saying I like beer, but I don't believe in organized breweries. I mean, you know, somebody's got to get together and make this stuff available.
Yeah. John, I'm interested to know, what do you make of organized religion? You know, on a practical level, if, you know, someone is listening to this and they very much feel they are living through this meaning crisis or have a crisis of meaning in their own lives, what sort of practices have you cultivated that you would recommend? And do you see a place for a more organized religion as one of those recommendations?
Well, I want to first speak to what Malcolm said. As given my argument earlier that meaning has to be communal, it has to be communally created, curated, and corrected in order for it to be meaning. If I just start using terms in a completely idiosyncratic way, you can't understand me, and truth becomes unavailable. And if you can't correct me in my claims, then we're in deep, deep trouble. You know, and this was what Wittgenstein was pointing out. Even Hegel got this. This was his fundamental critique of Kant. You need others beside yourself for the correction that is needed for meaning. That was Hegel's deep critique of Kant. So I take that the spiritual but not religious is a fundamental category mistake. I agree with Malcolm. It's an attempt to individualize and make a possession. I criticized that earlier of religio and meaning, and you can't do that. when we do research, by the way, often done by atheists, okay, like Gervais, not the comedian, another one. What it shows is people are not religious or non-religious because they're analytic thinkers versus associational thinkers, or because they have an overactive, hyperactive agency detector or anything like that. That's not the thing that does all the lifting. What does the lifting is what's called credibility enhancing displays. When people are doing things that from your perspective you don't understand, but you trust that they have a wisdom that you don't, so you commit to them, so that because you understand in some primitive sense that you need to undergo growth or transformation to get access to the truth that they have. As the child is to the adult is to the sage. You need role models. When you take a look at when people are aspiring to go through personal projects, whether academic or sports, what predicts? Well, all the planning they make, all the budgeting? No, what predicts success is, do they internalize the coach? Do they internalize a relevant role model? You need role models, and you need role models that are set within an ecology of practices, many different practices. We talk in our work about 4 dimensions. You need dialogical practices, you need imaginal practices, you need mindful practices, and you need embodied practices, DIME. And what you find cross-culturally, cross-historically, is the legacy religions do all of this. And they get that there's no panacea practice. This is one of the problems with the autodidactic, spiritual, but not religious. I do this one thing. There is no panacea practice. There cannot be. I can actually give you formal technical arguments for that being the case. But I'm just asking people to take it on faith right now. You always need a living ecology. You need a community in tradition with role models. That's what matters.
Absolutely.
Now, I am sympathetic to the spiritual but not religious, because what I think they're experiencing is one of the profound symptoms of the meaning crisis. If we don't share meaning, we don't trust each other. And we're in a trust apocalypse right now. The trust in the judicial system, the political system, the legal system, religious, and it's not just religious institutions that people don't want to belong to. People don't want to belong to any institutions. And when they get that dream fulfilled in COVID, they realize, oh, this is a disaster. That's the problem that for people so I feel a great deal of sympathy because these people are looking at the legacy religions with a history of, I'll be a little harsh, of caving into the Enlightenment in a lot of ways, especially in the West, and, all of the political and moral corruptions. It's no worse than the other institutions, but that's my point. There's no trust, and we can't restore trust. This is our biggest mistake right now. We can't restore trust with legislation.
Absolutely not. You
legislate trust.
People are replacing trust with micromanagement.
Yeah. Yes. Go ahead.
I mean, all this. Tick the boxes, and we won't look at your character. I mean, interestingly, you're talking about different disciplines converging on this, wanting to move beyond the kind of false dualisms of some versions of the Enlightenment. I mean, it's really interesting in ethics. If you look at, McIntyre's After Virtue, the recovery of virtue ethics as opposed to situation ethics is another example of this same recovery, I think, and convergence. Going back to your thing about the return of the sacred and also the role of myth, I noticed your phrase, John, about having a coach and then internalizing the coach. So the great mythopoeic expression of that is Dante's Divine Comedy, but particularly when he journeys with Virgil and you go, the vicious circles of hell are literally reversed and then become the virtuous spirals of the Purgatorio. But, Virgil, il mio maestro, he calls him, il mio autore, not only my author, but my authority. But do you remember at the end, when he finally, as it were, recovers humanity and is in the garden, and he's returning to where we should have been in the first place? Virgil says to Dante, I crown and mitre thee over thyself. So the two huge images of authority, the secular authority in the crown and the sacral authority in the mitre, having been out there and directed you, must now, become in here as well. And it's the point of true human maturity. It's Virgil, the older autore, bestowing on Dante mature humanity. I crown and mitre thee over thyself. It's one of the great moments.
Malcolm, before we go, I'd love you to talk about your new book as well, and how might that relate to what we're talking about in this meaning crisis?
So this is the first instalment of a kind of I hope will be the kind of magnum opus. So I'm I'm retelling, because I think one of the things that we're talking about when we return to the sacred, one of the ways we can be helped, because you mentioned zeitgeist and the spirit of our own age has certain good things, but it has its blind spots, which we've been discussing. And one of the ways of recovering from that is reading earlier things, reading old books as well as new ones. But then the danger of that is mere antiquarianism and a kind of consumerist nostalgia. So the great thing you have to do with the old stories is retell them. And I retell them. I'm retelling what's called the Matter of Britain, the entire cycle of stories around Merlin and Arthur and the Grail and in all their glory, but also in, their tragedy and, but the key is the Grail. The key is, for me, is the idea of the sacred suddenly, no longer at the holy end of the church, but appearing miraculously in the court. I write on the conviction that all these stories are older and wiser than we are. And every generation puts different questions to the stories. And I felt the time had come, in light of all of this. I mean, some people have talked about this work as being, that I'm engaged in a project of re-enchantment. And there's a sense in which that's true. But I find the word re-enchantment slightly problematic. I don't think it's in our power to enchant the world, but I don't think the world was ever disenchanted. I think the world is enchanted. We have to undisenchant ourselves. And I hope that the first of 4 volumes. It's going to be literally an epic ballad cycle. Anyway, I launch it, as it happens, tonight in the Temple Church.
Oh, amazing.
One of the most numinous places in London. So, yeah.
Oh, well, I hope it goes really well.
Thank you, yeah.
And John, I wonder, what's next for you in terms of this meaning crisis and tackling the meaning crisis? Is there anything you're working on at the moment?
I have a bunch of books coming out. I have Einstein and Spinoza's God. That's coming out. I have a book. I've taken the 3 courses, the 3. There was 3 installments on seeing God again for the first time. I'm turning that into a book. The main project, as I mentioned, for the advent of the sacred, because I agree with Malcolm, nostalgia is not what we're after here. We're after an advent, is, as I said, the philosophical Silk Road, which is going to be a YouTube video series, and there's going to be multiple levels to it. There's going to be the level of me on the pilgrimage and undergoing it and suffering it, which I did. And then there will be also some of the recorded deep dialogues, or I would like to say moments of dialogos between me and various people. Then we're also filming a lecture course where I present sort of an academic argument for that. So there's going to be sort of these 3 tiers, and they're all we're in the process of editing and creating and recording. Yeah, it is perhaps my magnus opus.
Yeah. So you're physically doing you've done the pilgrimage.
I've done one part of it. So I did the Neoplatonic.
I think this recovery of pilgrimage, physical pilgrimage, is part of what we're talking about.
Well, the book I'm working on in connection with the series is called The Philosophy of Pilgrimage and Philosophy as Pilgrimage.
No, I've walked the Cuthbert Way and the way into Canterbury, so that's an annual practice for me. And of course, for this, I had a kind of pilgrimage with my illustrator, Stephen Crotts, and we went, to Glastonbury and climbed the Tor and went to Tintagel and listened to the landscape.
There's a reason why places get proper names.
Yeah.
We and this is Mark Wynn's argument. We actually have friendship with places, proper friendship. Yeah. And they have a presence. So I endeavored to go to various places that had a powerful presence, to talk with somebody that could give me an existential encounter with that lineage, like Jonathan Pajot in Istanbul talking about Maximus the Confessor. Yeah. I'm going to do the same thing in India and Samarkand. I'm going to do the same thing in Kyoto about Dogen and Nishitani.
Oh, wow.
Wow. I wish you both well on your different kinds of pilgrimages. Malcolm Guite, John Vervaeke, it's been such an honor to speak to you, to learn from your wisdom. Thank you for joining us on Unbelievable.